So let me tell you about what we're talking about today. We're talking about human trafficking. Specifically, we're talking about sex trafficking. I want to set the context. I'm not doing a talk on it. I want to set you the context about why it's important, why I think we should talk about it here in this space. So I think I've for about 10 years have been aware of the vocabulary human trafficking or sex trafficking. You may have known about it longer. I became aware about 10 years ago. Finally started to get aware of just that phrase and what it was meaning. A few years ago, I got acquainted, and a lot of you got acquainted with Agape International Ministry or Mission, which is working in Cambodia. And I started to just understand the enormity of it, what it means to have children and women, being forced into this horrific and just terrible, awful, kind of trade that's just globally enormous. And because the people there's a demand for it. And but one of the things that happened when I first learned about it being in Cambodia was I started to sort of section off where it was at, and I started to think, well, of course, so it's in Cambodia and it's some places like that. And it took me a while to get my head around the fact it's not just in Cambodia or in places like that, but actually it's in the United States, and actually it's even right here. And so when I was starting to get aware of that, another piece of information was getting onto my radar screen, which was numbers of churches in the Sacramento region is increasing actually quite dramatically. Churches are planting churches are splitting from churches, there are all kinds of things happening that's increasing the numbers of churches here in this area. And so right now there's more than 600 churches in the Sacramento region, of which we're a part of. At the same time, there are over 600 churches, groups of people that say they're followers of Christ. The incident of sex trafficking in the Sacramento region has also skyrocketed. It is now one of the top regions in the entire country. And I was looking at those two really different pieces of data. Numbers of churches are increasing. Numbers of the demand for sex trafficking is increasing. The supply and demand is increasing. And so I was going, so what's wrong with this? Well, clearly, the Church of Jesus in this area is choosing not to take that issue on as a primary mission of what it means to follow Christ in its culture. And that just seemed all wrong to me. So a few years ago, I started actually talking about it, and I realized right away that I have no specific knowledge. I have general knowledge and a lot of emotion. And that'll get you a little ways, but to actually make a difference, you have to actually have specific knowledge. Same time I was starting to become aware of that, Noelle Cothern was completing a graduate degree in this issue in Illinois at one of the best universities for this area. And she started working in some government and government funded and in some secular businesses. And we need every group invested. It's not that was a wrong place to work, but she started to feel some need to actually have a right to be able to talk about this spiritually, because at the end of the day, this is also a spiritual issue. And so we made a decision a while ago to actually invest in that particular position. Noelle now is our Director of Social Justice and Compassion, and she is going to bring this message this morning. Noelle, as you come, I'm going to just say a prayer. So God, would you empower us to be able to hear? Would you take the words and information that Noelle's going to share and then the practical challenges to make actually a difference here in this area, in the United States and in the Sacramento region and in Auburn in specific. In your name I pray, amen.
So this morning when I was getting ready, Mr. Rob Elliott told me to not blow it. So, thank you, Rob. So if I screw up, you get to blame Rob, not me. When I was 16 years old, my life changed when I walked into a church and I met a prostituted individual. This time in my life, I went on a missions trip with my church, and we were serving in the city we lived in. And we were working with the local pastor, and he brought this woman in to come talk to us. And as she told us her story, I quickly realized that who I thought was a victim of prostitution was actually a victim of sex trafficking. Now, this woman was born into a family that struggled with substance abuse, and all of their energy and finances went to it. And when she was 10 years old, her mother's addiction hit its peak, and they had no money for her to get that next fix. So, in a moment of desperation, her mom quite literally took her daughter to the local pimp and sold her for drug money. And from that point on, this woman was being sold out for sex in the local community. And when I heard that, my understanding of the world as a 16-year-old completely shattered. And this woman must have seen how horrified I was when she told that story, because she looked at me and she said, I don't know if I'll ever get away from my pimp. I don't know if I'll ever get out of my situation, but I do know that I have hope, because for the first time in my life, I know love through Jesus Christ. And in that moment, my faith changed too, because if Christ could create hope for a woman who's being sold for sex, then he could create hope in any situation. But it also changed in how I responded to my faith, because I knew that Christ was responding to her, and so that my faith too had to lead me to respond to this woman's pain. And this woman is the reason that we're here today on Freedom Sunday. She's the reason I'm up here. It's not about, Freedom Sunday is not about being an edgy church. It's not talking about this trendy topic we hear in culture. It's all about bringing honor to that woman I met when I was 16. And when I met her, I started looking in my faith more and understanding where God wanted me to respond. And I came across Isaiah 58, and I want to use this passage to kind of give us a lens in what we're learning, because it's a difficult topic. There's not much hope, but when I learned of this woman, I knew that there was hope in here. So this verse talks about the type of worship Christ calls of us, how that worship changes us, and then in turn how it changes our community. So it's Isaiah 58, verses 6 through 12. I'll tell you what it really means to worship the Lord. Remove the chains of prisoners who are chained unjustly. Free those who are abused. Share your food with everyone who is hungry. Share your home with the poor and homeless. Give clothes to those in need. Don't turn away your relative. Then your light will shine like the dawning sun, and you will quickly be healed. Your honesty will protect you as you advance, and the glory of the Lord will defend you from behind. When you beg the Lord for help, he will answer, "Here I am." Don't mistreat others or falsely accuse them or say something cruel. Give your food to the hungry and care for the homeless. Then your light will shine in the dark. Your darkest hour will be like the noonday sun. The Lord will always guide you, provide good things to eat when you are in the desert. He will make you healthy. You will be like a garden that has plenty of water, or like a stream that never runs dry. And this is the best part. You will rebuild those homes left in ruins for years. You will be known as a builder and repairer of city walls and streets. So Freedom Sunday is about us as a church learning how to be those builders and repairers of the streets that are destroyed by sex trafficking. So I hope you guys join me on this journey as we learn a bit more about what sex trafficking is. Now, ever since meeting this woman, I've been incredibly passionate about talking to people about what the realities of sex trafficking really are. Because when I met that woman, I thought it was one thing, and I was shocked to see that it was completely different than what I had thought. So whenever I talk to groups, I always ask them to describe to me what someone looks like in sex trafficking and what society thinks of someone who's a prostituted individual. And regardless of age or gender, I always get the exact same answers. And I do this because it shows what society thinks victims are in sex trafficking and where sex trafficking is happening. So when people describe who is a person in sex trafficking, society says it's a young girl, she's in Cambodia, and she's quite literally locked in chains in a brothel because she's probably been kidnapped from her family. And she is a victim. She is being abused without her choice. And she is so much a victim that we're worth saving her, altering our lives to rescue her, and then inviting her in and restoring Christ's hope into our life. Sounds pretty familiar with sex trafficking. And then when I ask them to describe to me a prostituted individual, I also get the exact same answers. It's an adult woman, she's probably drug addicted, and she's in this lifestyle by choice, probably to feed that addiction. And she is a criminal. Her choices, since she's in there by choice, her choices are ruining the morality of our community, and we need to punish her and criminalize her for those choices. And since her choices are hurting our community, we don't want to just punish her, but we want to actually push her out, because if she's in our community, she'll destroy it. So those two people described are two very different people. We see one as a victim, and we see one as a criminal. Now, this person in sex trafficking in Cambodia, it looks like that in Cambodia. I've been there. It looks like that. But a victim of sex trafficking in the United States doesn't look like that. And that is why we have to understand who our victims are. And in the US, a victim looks so much more like that prostituted individual. And by the end of today's talk, I'm going to show you who our victims are here and how they're being trafficked. Now, excuse me. We hear about sex trafficking, we see posts of it on Facebook, we hear it in the news, on newspapers, and we're all coming at it from different angles. So I want to give us a definition that's used worldwide so that we can all start from the similar base. And sex trafficking is, by definition, the recruitment and transportations of individuals for the purpose of selling commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, and coercion. Now, force, fraud, and coercion, incredibly important in understanding sex trafficking, and we'll get into that more. Now, I also want to hit this term commercial sex acts just for a second, because if we don't know what those things are, we're not going to be able to understand who our victims are. So, victims are being forced to sell prostitution, they're being forced to work in strip clubs and massage parlors, and they're also being forced into pornography. So I don't say that to be shocking, I say that so we can understand who our victims are. Now that definition is used to define victims throughout our country or our world, but in the United States we have one extra definition we've added to it. And it is that if anyone is under the age of 18 and they are induced to perform these commercial sex acts, then they are automatically considered a victim. So if you're under 18 here in the States, you're a victim. Now, this definition helps us identify victims, but it also helps us identify who our trafficker is. In the United States, our trafficker is a pimp. This pimp with gang associations is our modern-day slaveholder. Now, this pimp, he knows that definition we have in society of who a victim of sex trafficking is, and who our prostituted individual is, and they know we see them differently. So, that pimp works really, really hard to get his victims to look much less like a victim of sex trafficking and much more like a prostituted individual. Because if he can make them look like a prostituted person, he knows we're not going to save them. He knows we'll think of them poorly and we'll leave them to him. So that is why it's so important we begin to understand who our victims are. Now, sex trafficking has to look different here in the United States. Pimps can't carry their victims around in chains. So how are they doing that? They're seeking out these individuals who are vulnerable and incredibly at risk, and they're controlling them through force, fraud, and coercion. And they're seeking out individuals who are runaways, throwaways, and foster care kids. And I use the word throwaway intentionally, because that woman I met when I was 16 was a throwaway. And he's seeking out homeless individuals, and they're also seeking out people who are physically and sexually abused already. These people are vulnerable and easier for the pimps to control. Now, he's using force, fraud, and coercion to traffic them, and I want to explain how that happens and how that force, fraud, and coercion are like chains linking these victims to their pimp. First of all, forced. A lot of women have just admitted that they were simply kidnapped by their pimp. They never chose to be in this lifestyle, they were just kidnapped. Fraud. Pimps are using fraud and tricking people into sex trafficking, and a big trend is that they're actually using other women to recruit kids in for them. And they're doing this, or forcing their victims to go out and recruit. Because a lot of people, if you're new on the streets or you're uncomfortable, you're much more likely to trust a woman than you are a man. So he'll send out a woman to a new kid on the street and say, it's super dangerous out here, you can't be out here on your own, why don't you come back with me and my boyfriend? And he'll take care of you, he did that for me, he's a great guy, why don't you come with me? The girl goes, and then quickly find out this is no boyfriend who's going to provide safety for her. Or she'll go up to a girl and tell her how beautiful she is and say, you're so beautiful, you could be a model. My boyfriend's a modeling agent. Why don't you come meet him and he can get you set up with modeling? Now, women, how many of us wish we were told we were beautiful enough to be a model? All of us. So that is a really easy sell for someone who's really vulnerable and never been told they're beautiful before. Now, pimps are also using fraud on their own. They are intentionally seeking out those vulnerable kids, those vulnerable people, and they are relentlessly pursuing them. They're taking them out on dates, they're telling them how wonderful they are, they're listening to their dreams and goals in life, and then they're telling them they love them. And they're claiming to be their boyfriend, or they're claiming to be their dad and say, I'll be the dad you never had. So someone who's never had a family, never been told they're loved, they're going to go with that person, and then it's too late. Now, pimps are also using coercion in sex trafficking. Say they get that girl to believe they're a boyfriend in a relationship, and that girl decides, well, I don't want to be around here, I don't want to be with you. Well, that pimp put in all that time to get to know her. So now he can craft really personal threats. And if she tries to leave, he says, well, if you leave, I'll hurt your little brother. Or if you leave, I'll hurt that teacher you really respected. Or these girls who are here with me, they'll all be hurt if you leave. So that force, fraud, and coercion, they're like chains that are linking these victims to their pimps, and they can't get away. So it's one thing to hear about this force, fraud, and coercion from me. I'm not a victim, I'm not a survivor. And it's a whole nother thing to hear it from someone who's actually survived this issue. So I'm going to show you a video. It's about a woman who survived sex trafficking as a child. It's hard to hear, but it's so important we hear it so we can understand who our victims are. So join me as we watch this.
You know, you're 12 years old and you're living with your moms, and your mom's is struggling because she didn't think that life was really going to work out like this for her, and she doesn't have a man around, and the men that are around haven't always been that great. Sexual abuse is becoming kind of normal for you, and you think that other people don't have secrets that are as bad as you, and maybe you've tried to talk to somebody at school and they haven't really heard you, or maybe they just haven't had time to listen to you. And so you're seeing these girls on the videos, and they're so pretty and they're so sexy, and so your way at 12 of escaping into this fantasy world is to think about what it must be like to be one of these girls, and you know the adult men already look at you, and you wonder how you can kind of use that.
I was just a child, and that's how I was supposed to live, like a child and like an adult.
So one day you're coming out of school and there's a guy outside in a Cadillac, and he's nice looking. I mean, he's got the baseball cap and the jeans and the Timbs, and he tells you how pretty you are, and you know how pretty your hair looks, and it's been a while since anybody even really noticed anything about you. And for the first time, you feel like somebody's really interested in you, because now all of a sudden he's asking you about your dreams and your hopes and where your father's at, and he says that he can be a daddy to you.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was dependent on for support.
And so that night he takes you to a club and he puts you up on the stage and he gives you a few drinks, and there's men throwing dollars at you, and it's scary, but all the time you're just looking at his face in the back of the room, and he's like, you know, go ahead baby girl, go ahead, you're doing it for daddy. And you're feeling proud because nobody's ever said that to you. And so then that night he tells you that there's more stuff that you've got to do, and he takes you into a room and there's a man there, and he tells you to strip, and you think this is something you'll never do, and yet there's a part of you that already knew how to do this, because that's what your stepfather's been doing to you all these years before. And so you turn that trick, and it's like a part of you has died inside. And so you come out of the club that night, and you get in the car, and you know he's pumping 50 Cent, and he takes you to McDonald's, and he tells you, you did a good job tonight, sweetie. And he's stuffing his pockets with the $1,000 that he made. And right now, you're happy.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was dependent on for support.
You feel like this is the best that it's ever going to get, and everything else in your life has prepared you for this moment. All the sexual abuse, or the neglect, or the drama, or the pain, or the trauma has prepared you for tonight, where you stepped across a line that you always thought you'd never really quite step across. And you don't realize that night what it'll be like to be on the track and get raped. And you don't realize that daddy isn't really going to protect you. You don't realize what it's like to have a gun held to your head that night. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you catch your first STD. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you first come home and daddy beats you for the first time because you didn't make enough money. You don't know what it's going to be like to have cops offer to trade sex with you in exchange for not being arrested. And then sometimes you'll do that and they'll still lock you up anyway. You don't know what it's like to sit up in jail and know that you just made $1,500 for your pimp last night, but he won't come down and put $200 bail on just to get you out a few days early. You don't know what it's like to walk down the street at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're just getting off work and people are starting their day and they see you and they know what you do and they look at you in a way that you just don't feel like you belong in that world anymore. And you don't know what it's like to feel like you've lost part of yourself along the way and to feel like you'll never leave. And no matter how many times you try to leave, he'll always find you and catch you. But that night, all you care about is the fact you're riding in a Cadillac and you're eating McDonald's and you're listening to 50 and you got this one man who you really think loves you sitting right by your side.
So that video isn't easy to watch, but I showed it because it gives us a really good example of what being a victim of sex trafficking is like. It shows us how powerful those pimps' control is over these girls with force, fraud, and coercion. It shows that they can't get away. And in that video, it said the average age of entry into prostitution is age 12 in the United States. And that is absolutely true. And that is why we have that definition in our definition of sex trafficking, that anyone under the age of 18 is a victim. But what happens to that girl when she turns 18 years old? What happens when she's 18 in a day? All of a sudden, that law we have doesn't protect her. And all of a sudden, that view in society we have that when you're an adult, you have a choice, we put that on her. We say, you're 18 now, you know what your choices are, and you can choose if you want to leave. But I'm going to challenge that thought and say, she made it to 18 with this guy. He has way more control over her now as an 18-year-old than he did as a 12-year-old. So she can't go anywhere. And when we view these adult women, when we only see children as victims and not adults, it's enslaving them to their pimps even more. And I want to bring the story back to that woman I met when I was 16 years old. She was standing there. She didn't have chains on her. She wasn't next to her pimp. She was there by choice. And she was telling me about all the abuse she went through. Being a 16-year-old, I raised my hand and said, if it's so horrible, why don't you leave? Luckily, she was really nice to me. But she looked at me and she said, honey, if I could have left, I would have left a long time ago. But I'm the one who's paying the price for my mother selling me to a pimp. I'm the one who's paying the criminal ramifications for my pimp selling me out for sex. I'm the one with all the prostitution arrests, not my pimp. So with my hundreds and hundreds of prostitution arrests, how am I going to get a job? Nobody wants to hire me because no one wants to be my coworker. Where am I going to rent an apartment? No one wants to rent to me because no one wants to be my neighbor. I'll ruin the neighborhood, or so they think. So when we refuse to see that adults aren't victims, we're enslaving them to their pimp, just like that woman I met when I was 16. That's why it's so important we understand who these victims are so that we can truly bring freedom into their lives. Now, I want to talk the last part about the demand of sex trafficking. And the demand is the reason we have sex trafficking. If there were no demand for those commercial sex acts, we would not have pimps providing victims. And demand is threefold. It's individuals who patronize the sex trade. It's pimps who forcefully provide individuals to the public through forced prostitution, forced work in strip clubs and massage parlors, and forced participation in pornography. Then this third piece, which I think is the reason we have a demand, is we live in a culture that says, as an adult, it's normal or acceptable to patronize the sex trade. We get to choose to participate. And if you've seen any Carl's Jr. commercials, it proves my point. So, church, this is where we say no. This culture piece is where we fight and end sex trafficking. So, now we know what sex trafficking is, we know who our victims are, and we know how they're being trafficked. How do we respond to this demand? Well, we're going to address this demand today. I hear a lot of people say sex trafficking is happening in Sacramento, and it's definitely not happening in Placer County, and for sure not Auburn. I live in Sacramento. It's absolutely happening there through forced prostitution, massage parlors, and strip clubs. But I want to challenge that thought as well, because now we know Sex trafficking is more than those three pieces of the commercial sex trade. Commercial sex trade also includes victims being forced into pornography. And I can promise you that is happening all over Placer County, and that is happening here in Auburn. It's happening in our neighborhoods, our schools, our businesses, and it's happening in our churches. And this is where we're going to address this today. XXX Church says there's over 420 million pornographic websites online today. And pimps are not using that passively. They're putting their victims in there, and they are relentlessly seeking out our kids. They are relentlessly seeking out our teenagers, and they are relentlessly seeking out every one of us in this room. They're hoping that we'll accidentally click on that link on Facebook, we'll click on that YouTube link, or the spam email we get on our smartphone. They're hoping we do that in a moment of weakness or confusion and open that door to the demand. But today we're going to take the action and tell culture and pimps that we're not buying what they're selling. We're not even going to participate at all. And so, church, I'm going to ask you to take action. Out in the lobby, I have flyers that talk about internet accountability. And I'm going to challenge all of you to put internet accountability on your smartphones, on your tablets, and your computers. Now, it'll show you how to do it, but all of these softwares require an accountability partner. Some of you might say, I don't struggle with this piece of demand. Why do I need to do this? Here's the thing. We can't fight sex trafficking on our own. If it's one individual going and one individual on their own, we'll never end it. But if we start talking about it, if we start making it normal to address this piece of demand, this is where we end it. We can stop it here today. So, get this flyer, put it on your internet devices. Women, we're not excluded from this. The use of women struggling with the addiction of porn has gone up dramatically in the last few years. Women, get this, put it on your devices, show other women how to fight the demand. Men, get this, show other men how to fight the demand. I'm going to ask you to do one more thing. I'm going to ask you to be bold enough to sign your name to the sheet of paper out in the lobby that says you will fight the demand and by putting internet accountability in our lives. And we're proving to culture that we're not participating in this demand and we don't want to be a part of it. Now this commitment, I'm not going to use your names to show anyone else, but if we ever encounter a victim, we can say, look how many people in our community are fighting for you. Look how many of us are standing up for you. So I really encourage you to take this seriously. And then finally, parents, I said that these pimps are relentlessly seeking out our kids online. We have a parenting class for grandparents, aunts, uncles, coaches. If you interact with kids, sign up for March 26th, where we learn to help our kids not be vulnerable, but we also help our kids to say no to the demand as well. And we can stop this cycle of demand with our kids so that we can end sex trafficking. So, Upper Room Community Church, let's start changing culture. Let's start fighting for victims. Let's bring hope for people in our community who are struggling with the demand, and in turn, bring hope to victims. So let's learn how to be the builders and repairers of our cities that are being destroyed by sex trafficking. Thanks.